Thank you, Chair. Morning, everybody. Now, no pressure, but of course, so much depends on you getting all of your forecasts absolutely right. And you've recently revised your scarring assumptions from 3% down to 2% of GDP, but you remain more pessimistic than the Bank of England's latest estimate of 1.4% of GDP. How do you see the balance of risks around scarring and the consequences for fiscal policy if you're either too pessimistic or too optimistic?
So it is something which we keep under constant review, and we have revised it down in light of what we've learned about this, in particular, as I mentioned, the effectiveness of the vaccines in allowing our lives to return to normality, and also the effectiveness of government policy in keeping that capacity alive such that it can then be deployed as our lives normalise. We will learn more about the consequences of how the economy functions with the vaccines fully rolled out, but also government support fully withdrawn over the coming months. I think we have to bear in mind that the furlough scheme was just closed in September. A lot of support for businesses has only just rolled off. We haven't really seen how the UK economy functions without all of that fiscal support being provided. And so we will have to keep that scarring judgment under review. One thing I would say, though, about some of the components of that judgment are, as I mentioned, on the labour supply components, some of the labour supply relates to the fact that inactivity rates have already risen. We have seen some net emigration from the country, or net migration fall to zero. We make some assumptions about how many people will come back to the UK as travelling conditions normalise, the economy normalises, but we'll have to keep that under review to see whether those predictions are borne out. As Charlie mentioned also, we have just foregone some investment during the pandemic. That is capital stock, which is just not there, which we'd previously forecast being there. So we've lost about £70 billion worth of investment as a result of just businesses not investing during the pandemic. If there's a bigger resurgence in investment now than we expected, perhaps on the back of the super deduction, we will also keep that under review, and that might lead us to revisit our assumption again in future. We are essentially data-driven in terms of what we see. We know what we know now about the labour supply. We know what we know now about the levels of investment. We'll keep this assumption under review as more information comes to light.
Okay, but just to clarify, are you expecting that assumption to change then? Is that what you're basically saying?
I think we keep it under review in light of the data. At the moment, it's our best judgment on what's going to be the long-term consequences of the pandemic for the economy. If in future data surprises us in one direction or another, we'll of course revisit that assumption in future forecasts.
Okay, so to what extent are the supply bottlenecks that we're seeing consistent with your forecasts for scarring?
I think they're consistent with an economy which has got more demand than supply at the moment, and that does suggest that there are some constraints on the potential output of the economy, although again it's important to bear in mind that this is not just a UK phenomenon but also a global one. These supply bottlenecks are happening in all advanced economies. A lot of them relate actually to supply constraints in Asia rather than necessarily ones being faced by the UK economy. We do have particular challenges in areas like HGV drivers and finding people in sort of key logistical jobs in the economy. And because we're also more dependent on the gas supply for energy, we're particularly exposed to gas prices compared to some other advanced economies which depend more on renewables or on nuclear or other sources of energy. So some of these bottlenecks bite a bit harder in the UK than they do in other economies. But this is a global phenomenon of basically lots of economies reopening all at once. And lots of actual demand for goods is what people who postpone their durable goods purchases during the pandemic all went out and wanted to buy things for their houses, cars, and where these things are produced are struggling to produce some of the major components like semiconductors. We'll have to keep that under review along with everything else. But for us, at least in the UK context, it gave us some reason to think that there are constraints not just on the demand side of the economy, but also on the supply side.
Okay, so you're saying it's a global problem, but it's more difficult in the UK because of shortages in labour in some areas and our over-reliance on fossil fuels. Okay, and your scarring judgment, in your words, anchors the output forecast and is a major determination, of course, of how much the Chancellor has to spend. But you acknowledge that, quote, with the passage of time, it will be increasingly difficult to distinguish the effects of the pandemic from other factors like Brexit or the productivity puzzle. Now, I realise it's obviously very tricky to work out what's harmed our country and our economy more. Is it a global pandemic when millions of people have died, or is it our decision to continue with Brexit? But I'm just wondering for yourselves, how can we hold you accountable for whether or not you've made the right judgment on scarring when it is so difficult to work out exactly what the main cause of our current difficulties are?
That's right. And I suppose I'd say two things about that. One is that in trying to decompose sort of different structural changes that we have to take into account when forecasting the economy, I mean, one thing that is the case is that Brexit and the pandemic happened at different points in time. So you can look for turning points in data which happened at different points in time. And that's one of the things which we've taken into account when trying to disentangle these two effects. And we have reported them separately, and we do think that they have separate impacts on the economy, not least because they affect different sectors of the economy, right? I mean, Brexit mostly affects the tradable goods sector. The pandemic mostly affects the non-tradable services sector. So you can, to some extent, differentiate their effect on different parts of the economy.
Sorry, just to interrupt on that point, but just to refer to your previous question where you said we've been hit harder globally because of shortages in labour in some areas, and surely Brexit, HGV drivers being one of them, has meant that we've had a harder impact.
That's true. I mean, certainly the fact that it's been Brexit's been one factor in making it harder to find HGV drivers, although it's important to bear in mind that most of the fall in the labour force has actually been from early retirement on the part of UK-born workers rather than those that come from Europe. But it clearly makes it more difficult to find labour from the kind of options that we've had in the past. But the fact that these two things happen at separate points in time allows us to look at the data somewhat differently and interrogate it differently, look for turning points. And the other thing to say is you can also differentiate between the effects that these two things have had on our trade with the rest of the world versus our trade with Europe. Okay. Our trading relationship with the rest of the world has more or less gone back to normal or gone back to pre-pandemic levels in the last few months. Trade with Europe is still down significantly, which suggests that there is something going on with our trade with the rest of Europe, which is different from what's going on with our trading relationship with the rest of the world.
It's really interesting, and I'll be quick because I'm coming back to you all a bit later on. So just one more question. Do you think additional fiscal stimulus in the near term could help reduce long-term scarring, and is that something you incorporate into your forecast?
We are explicitly forbidden from providing advice to government on what they should do with fiscal policy. We just take account of what they do with fiscal policy. I suppose what I can say is that we have, compared to what we thought in March and then compared to what we saw before, I think been pleasantly surprised at how successful the government's coronavirus rescue package has been in preventing what we thought could have been much higher levels of unemployment than we've seen, and also preserving businesses so that they can go back into trading once public health conditions allowed them to do so. But I should also say that what we haven't seen yet is an economy which isn't being provided significant amounts of life support from the public finances, and we will have to see how that performs in the coming months.